Thank you, Kathy. You may be familiar that Cornell had hosted some corn silage hybrid trials in the past, and this program is where individual companies submit hybrids for testing, and they're all grown side by side in a small plot comparison. So it's a whole bunch of hybrids from a number of companies that get compared with each other. So we started this back up in 2016 after a few years of not having the trials in New York State. They were discontinued in the past due to some staffing and funding issues, and there was a big push from the dairy community in the state to bring the program back, and some leadership from the Department of Animal Science and Plant Breeding and Genetics at Cornell, namely Tom Overton and Margaret Smith, who put a lot of work into getting this program back up and running. And so I'd certainly like to acknowledge that and the support we've got to do this. We kind of got a late start this year with me coming on board in March. So if you are familiar with looking at the results of the trials in the past, we have a smaller group this year. We had 29 hybrids from 8 companies planted at 2 sites in the state. We're expecting this number to be bigger for 2017. We've already got a lot of interest from additional companies that weren't able to participate in 2016 that are ready and willing to participate next year. Also moving forward, we're looking at having more than 2 locations. That was, again, starting the program, getting our feet under us again. We went with less locations, but part of having this data, part of the value was seeing how these same hybrids do across multiple growing conditions. So in the future, having more locations will help us build that data back up. And so if you're interested in the agronomy side of it, these are small plots planted, 2-row plots planted at 34,000 seeds per acre. We follow the fertility and weed control programs of the farms that we're hosting the plots on, and we have soil samples to know that the fertility we're putting under this crop is what it needs to understand your growing conditions. So that's kind of the background on the agronomy side. So we're doing this with a plot planter, 2 rows at a time. And then we're coming in with a harvest unit that's also harvest 2 rows. And you can see here the unit harvests and sends the material back to a weigh cell. So in that weigh cell, we get a weight for the plot to determine our yield, and we also can pull forage quality samples out of that to be sent to the lab. All our samples this year were sent to Cumberland Valley Lab for analysis, because we know when we're looking at corn silage, yes, yield is important, but the quality side of it is at least equally important to the yield, and I would argue actually more important than the yield. So we'll get into that discussion as we go on. So with the 2 locations we had this year, it was really interesting to see what the weather patterns were. Depending on what part of the state you're coming from, we know that many areas of the state experienced some very, very dry conditions this year, and that was no different at our sites. If you can see here, so our Aurora location, that's in Cayuga County in central New York, Cornell Research Farm. The Madrid site, that's St. Lawrence County up in northern New York, and that's on a commercial dairy farm. And we had, looking at what we had for rain this season versus the average, we were well below normal at both sites. But what's interesting to look at is while we were below normal, when we look at the yield data, the Madrid site actually yielded much higher. That corn looked much healthier all season long. Didn't look drought stressed at all. So it was a bit of a surprise to get to the end of the season and see how how little rainfall it actually got because the corn looked nice all year. Contrary to that, the Aurora site was extremely drought stressed, especially in the month of July. Looked really poor. By the end of July, I was wondering if we were even going to have a plot to harvest or if it was all going to die. But then we got some rain in August that brought it back around. So very different. Even though the total seasonal rainfall was about the same, very different looking corn at the two sites. So part of what explains that is if we look at when that rain came. At Aurora, we had some rain in early May, and then most of the rest of May, June, and most of July was very dry, with just a little, most of that rain in July coming at the end of the month. So we had a long, extended drought period there, followed up by a pretty rainy August for that location. Contrary to that, the Madrid location, even though the total rainfall wasn't any more, we see that it was much more evenly spaced throughout the season. And in fact, that lower rainfall number in May probably helped that crop establish a better root system. Generally, if it's dry in the spring, that corn will put down a deeper root system, which can help it later in the summer. So we probably benefited from that at Madrid as well. So for harvest, I already showed the picture of the harvester, but we're taking 2-row plots. We're trying to do this by whole plant dry matter because whole plant dry matter is definitely the most important, aspect in terms of timing harvest of corn silage. So we're targeting 33 to 35% dry matter. At the Aurora location where the corn was nearly dead at the end of July and then got rehydrated with the August rains, it made it quite difficult to time harvest because we had very variable dry matters in those plants with all the stress they were under throughout the season. We harvested that site by maturity group on 3 different dates to try to get the harvest dry matters as close to what we wanted as possible. When we went up to Madrid, that was a long trip to haul all the equipment and everything up there, so we just harvested that all on the same date. So as you would expect, we saw at Madrid that the longer season stuff came off slightly wetter than the earlier stuff. Again, all planted on the same day, all harvested on the same day, so we would expect to see that difference. And you can also see here that we had some pretty respectable yields at the Madrid site. And as I mentioned, it really did well all season long. If we move over to the Aurora location, we actually ended up with much better yields than I thought we might have, but still well below what we would normally expect at that site due to the stress it was under. And you can see there we had the dry matters fairly dialed in, but it was kind of interesting because with the longer season stuff, once it finally did decide to dry down, it started really dropping in a hurry. So when we harvested that, it was actually dropping pretty fast, but we still got it in the range that we were hoping for. So despite all the weather challenges, we had a pretty successful season. We talk a lot about the rainfall patterns and how that influences yield. It's also important to recognize that we were dealing with 2 very different sites in terms of the field history and the soils. We know that we put a lot of importance on soil health these days and understand it's not just the fertilizer you put under the crop, that it's the overall health of the soil in terms of how it can support that crop and how resilient it is to extremes in the growing season. So at Madrid, this is a commercial dairy farm, quite a bit of manure history, first-year corn after a sod, so there's lots of nitrogen there for it, higher organic matter content. That helps with water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity. All that helped that site in a season, especially like this with lower rainfall. The Aurora site, on the other hand, is at a research farm. it's long term. It's been in row crops, different research projects going on, no real manure history there. So we see, a big difference in the quality of that soil, even though it had all of the fertilizer it needed. The quality of the soil itself didn't have that resilience in it to handle the drought conditions. So that's kind of the agronomic and the field, the planting side, harvest, all that. One of the big things here, though, is the quality of this silage. And we made a big change with the New York trials this year. In the past, and if you still look at trials from other programs, other universities, there's some private groups like Western New York Crop Management Association that has their own trials. The common thing for over a decade now has been to use the Milk 2006 program, and that gives you a number of milk per ton. So that was an attempt to look at the quality of the forage and predict how many pounds of milk you could get out of that ton of forage. And when it was first developed, it was had some pretty, it really helped advance the conversation on forage quality and get people thinking more about the potential of that crop. And then if we multiply that milk per ton by the yield per acre, we get a milk per acre number. So that helps us rank the hybrids. The trouble is that over time, as there's been a lot of advances in the dairy nutrition community in terms of how rations are developed, what forage quality parameters they're looking at to develop rations, the Milk 2006 program didn't necessarily keep up with that anymore. And so we were looking for a new way to approach this, a new way to predict how the quality of these samples would affect milk yield. And to do that, we, with the leadership of Tom Overton and Mike Van Amberg and Animal Science, we use the Cornell model. If you're not familiar with it, it's a program that models a diet and how the cow will respond to that diet. It's the backbone of some commercial programs that several feed companies use to feed a lot of cows, not only in New York State but worldwide. A lot of cows are fed with a program that utilizes the information in this model. So we set up a ration to feed to try to get 100 pounds of milk per day out of a second lactation animal. And you can see some of the numbers there if you're interested in that side of it. And we used average values. So we went to the feed library and used average values for the corn silage, the haylage, and all the other ingredients that went into the ration and balanced this ration for 100 pounds of milk. Now we did this, the first take at this was predicting an allowable milk yield for each hybrid. So after we made this ration with this average corn silage, we took out the corn silage, that average sample, and all 29 of the hybrids that were in the trial, we entered in the forage sample from each of those hybrids into the exact same ration with the exact same pounds of dry matter, and looked at how the quality of that particular hybrid affected that ration. So we did that, and that gave us a predicted milk yield. And then we had the model calculate the expected dry matter intake. So each of these hybrids that we used in the ration had a different fiber digestibility level, and that influences how much the cow can actually eat before the rumen is filled up. So by doing that, it adjusted the amount of feed the cow could eat, and subsequently influenced the predicted milk yield. So what that gave us was a predicted milk yield that took this fiber digestibility into consideration. And just to give you an example, of 2 different hybrids that were in the study. This is the degradation rates so at the 30, 120, and 240 hour time points that are typically being measured now in the lab. And we see that fast pool of fiber that gets digested in the first 30 hours, and then a slower digestion after that. And at the end of 240 hours, what's left is that undigested material. So the amount of that undigested material is going to influence how fast the cow gets filled up and how much she can eat. And you can see just in these 2 hybrids, there's quite a bit of difference in that undigested factor that's left over. So that's obviously going to have an influence on milk yield. And if we look at the 29 hybrids in the trial and the dry matter intake, the original ration was balanced for 60 pounds of dry matter of the total ration. So that's the red line going across the middle. And we see 2 things here. We see that the predicted dry matter intake of all these different hybrids varied quite a bit from that 60 pounds. And we also see a pretty noticeable trend that essentially all of the Aurora, these same hybrids at Aurora, had a much higher digestibility, which resulted in higher predicted dry matter intakes, while the Madrid site, the same hybrids, had a lower digestibility, which limited dry matter intake to below the 60 pounds that the original ration had in it. So all that, that by itself becomes really interesting, and we'll get into it more as we go through this in terms of just how much impact the weather had on the digestibility of that forage. So you can see here the differences, and what that translated to is here's each of the hybrids at the Madrid location. If we start working our way across from the list of hybrids, we see the yield. Again, pretty respectable yields at this site. We look at the dry matters at harvest, and then the next column is that first prediction of a allowable milk yield without adjusting for the intake. So we can see here that there's not a lot of spread there. The predicted milk yield of these hybrids is all pretty close, just over 100 pounds of milk. So you start down the column, 104.5, 103.6, 103.6. So that's the column we're in, and we see not a lot of difference. As soon as we adjust that for the dry matter intake, and this is the same numbers that I showed in that bar graph before, all of these dry matter intakes have dropped below the original 60 pounds that we predicted. Then that affects how much the cow is eating, and we see that the predicted milk yields, when we adjust for that intake potential, a lot of them drop below 100 pounds that we were initially targeting. So we're seeing here that there's a pretty big effect of that digestibility on the predicted milk yield. Now, this is where I always caution folks to not necessarily look at the absolute value. We have to keep in mind that these are small research plots, and we're using a model to predict these numbers. So we feel very comfortable that this is a good way to rank these hybrids, that we can look at the yield and how they compared to their counterparts at that location in terms of yield. And we can also feel comfortable that we can look at the numbers and see how they ranked up against each other on the predicted milk. So we can use it as a ranking tool, but I would caution you against using the actual numbers. So, if we start at the top of the list there, to take that 26.6 tons and 97.4 pounds of milk, those numbers are specific to this trial here, but the way the hybrids perform and rank is is more important than those absolute values. So I just want to, as you're looking at the data, just keep that in mind.
I have to be connected before.
And if we switch to the Aurora site, we see much lower crop yields, as we already talked about. A similar trend in the allowable milk with equivalent dry matter intakes. Not a big spread between them, but in this case we saw more digestible forage, higher adjusted dry matter intakes for the TMR, and that led to much higher predicted milk yields compared to the Madrid site. So again, not drought stress forage, not as much of it to feed. So the risk here would be, did you get enough tons to feed your herd? But clearly some much higher quality stuff in terms of how the cow may react to this forage. So to try to summarize what's in these tables, we plotted this predicted milk yield against the crop yield. And what you get is a graph that is divided up into 4 quadrants, and it's divided by the average for that site. So going across, you see the overall mean milk potential. So that's the average milk potential at that at the Madrid location, which we see is just shy of 100 pounds. And then going up and down, we see an average crop yield of about 28.5 tons. So with that, that kind of separates us into our 4 quadrants, and our upper right quadrant is hybrids that were above the average in both the yield and the predicted milk. So those were the kind of the top performers. And the ones that have an X or asterisk there, numbers 28 and 14, what that indicates is they performed in that above average category at both locations. Now, if we had 5 or 6 locations, that would be even more impressive. With 2 locations, with different growing conditions, it's nice to see that those 2 consistently perform above average at both locations. It gives you an idea that they're pretty consistent performers. But again, 2 sites isn't a lot. So going forward, as we add more locations to the trials, if you had a hybrid that performed in that above average category at all of the sites with 5 or 6 locations, you'd have a better handle on how consistently that hybrid would perform. Another thing I point out here is if you look up towards the top, you'll see number 17 was the 1 BMR entry we had. So we had only 1 BMR entry into the program this year, and it basically performed as I would have expected. It was a stressful year, so I don't want to knock the yield of it. I mean, I still think it performed pretty well, but you see it was below the average in yield. But in terms of its predicted milk, and especially when we take into consideration that we were adjusting these on the fiber digestibility, we would expect that BMR to be much more digestible and the cows would eat a larger amount of it. So I think it's interesting to see where that landed compared to the conventional hybrids in the trial. And, it's a conversation to have about what you gain by using BMR versus what you may sacrifice with its use. So having that plotted against the other hybrids presents an interesting conversation to have when you're making seed selections with your nutritionist and seed representatives. So if we switch and look at that same graph for the Aurora location, same manner in which this was put together, just our averages were different. We have a much higher average milk potential here, but a lower average yield, but the same idea. And these are also color coded. And, another thing that I like to point out is that if you just quickly look at this information, it's color coded, and the orange is the longer season stuff, and it certainly looks here as the longer season stuff did better yield wise than the shorter season stuff, and we'll get into that a little bit here as we go on of some more discussion on that, because it's hard to just take that at face value. You got to look more at the weather data and how that might have influenced it. So what influences the crop yield here? We have the weather patterns. We know rainfall, growing degree days, our pest control, our fertility management are all things that are going to influence that crop. We also know that the corn needs moisture at pollination to pollinate well and put on a good ear. So we know that can have an effect not only on yield, because that ear is about 50% of the dry matter intake, 50% of the dry matter yield of that plant. So it's not only a yield thing, but it also could affect starch content. Also, an important thing to hear when we think about how long a season corn we're growing is the ability for this crop to mature before we start getting cooler in September and lose some of those heat units to finish off the crop, because when it comes to silage, we definitely want to finish that crop off in a manner that's going to allow us to get it harvested on time and put up when we want to. So just to review what our weather was, again, much more timely rainfalls. Each of those bars represents an individual rainfall event at both locations. So much more timely rainfalls at Madrid, but no more rain for the total season. And if we plot the relative maturities of these hybrids versus yield, on the top in blue we have the Madrid site, and if we look there, a lot of scatter, a very low R-squared value, so very little correlation between the maturity group and yield. So a lot of other things going on there had more influence on the yield than just selecting a longer season hybrid. On the Aurora site in the orange, we had a little bit stronger relationship there, a higher R-squared value, and a stronger relationship between maturity group and yield. But again, I would go back to the weather data and say that is more related to when the rains came than the actual maturity group. It was more of a timing thing, because we know from our field notes that some of the early season stuff started pollinating before we got the rain. So that was pollinating when there was less under drought conditions, and so it wasn't putting on as good of an ear. Where the later season stuff had the benefit of getting some rain showers before and during its pollination that allowed it to put on a better ear. So while it looks like maturity group explained some of the yield difference, it's actually the stage of growth that maturity group was at when the rain came that actually had a bigger impact than just growing a longer season corn. And if we look back at the Cornell trials in the past, from 2007 to 2013, we can see a similar thing here, that so all of these little circles represent over 1,300 samples that were taken during that time period. And we see that the year and the location had a much bigger impact than maturity group, because we had some corn that was less than 85 days that actually yielded almost 35 tons to the acre, which is pretty impressive. So that must have been, obviously it was a really good growing season. If we go all the way over to the other side, to the 111 to 115 day corn, we see there that we had some good years, some years where it yielded really well, but we also had some challenging years where its yields were quite low as well. So just to reinforce that, that maturity group shouldn't be a real driving factor in terms of trying to select for higher yields and that sort of thing. So now, turning the conversation from the crop yield to the milk yield, and thinking about the growing conditions we had at these two locations and how differently the forage analysis came back for these two locations, what's driving that? And Dairy One has done a study over the last few years and looking at just that individual months worth of rainfall and heat unit data throughout the year and how that affects digestibility. And the results of that study are what many people already kind of knew, is that as we increase rain and heat units, we get lower digestibility. And many farmers and nutritionists have experienced that, where in a certain growing season, something may look pretty good on paper, but the cows just don't respond to it like you'd hope they do. And now that we're looking at these more detailed digestibility numbers and getting a better understanding of that, we can are getting a better idea of just why that stuff may not feed as good as we might expect in certain years. And it also offers a chance for a farm to start having a discussion with their nutritionist before the crop's even harvested about how that might feed out this winter and what adjustments you might want to be planning to make to the ration. So as we, if we have a real hot, wet summer, then we could, pretty well predict that this is going to have a negative impact on digestibility. And come December, whatever month that you break into that new forage, and start feeding it, you want to be prepared for that. And while we can't change the weather, by understanding this stuff better, we have a better idea of planning ahead for how we can manage it. So this is just plotting all of the points from the two sites on one graph, just to put it in context. What we already talked about is that the Aurora site certainly yielded less than Madrid, but those predicted milk values are quite a bit higher. But again, even though it might look like that the longer season stuff, or that yielded higher, the higher yielding stuff at Aurora had a little less milk potential, there is a slight trend line there, but you can see a very low R-squared value and a lot of scatter in those points. So we really can't put a lot of emphasis on that point. There's a little bit of a trend there, but it's not. It's really not significant to what we're talking about. And then we were curious about how that rainfall, especially at Aurora, affected starch. If we look at the Aurora numbers for starch, that we do see that there was a slightly lower average starch content at with the earlier maturing hybrids. And again, as I said before, we expected that partially because those were pollinating under drought stress conditions. So, but it wasn't actually as big of a difference as we thought we might see. So even though it was slightly lower in starch with the early season stuff, but we actually saw that it performed pretty darn well given how drought stricken it was and the stress that it was under. So just another consideration. We talked a lot about digestibility today, but certainly starch is important, and as we look at the starch and how weather can affect that as well, it's another thing to keep in mind. So that's what I have for you today. We have published a full report of these results that can be found on the web at either of these web addresses. They're cross-linked with each other. There's my email address. Happy to take questions or comments. And as I started out by saying, we're building this program back up after not having it for a few years. So we're excited about the response we're getting from the seed companies moving forward. We've been talking a lot with our neighbors in Vermont and Pennsylvania about further collaboration between the states and doing these trials so that we can have a more unified approach to how we do these and using the data better. you know, we're always looking for your feedback on making these better. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
So Joe, while people are thinking about questions, I had an idea, a question for you. You were talking about expanded number of locations. Ideally, what would you be looking for to have? What kind of locations, kind of numbers would you like to see?
So it's all a bit of a balancing act between having as many, having more locations to represent more growing environments and keeping it to something that we can manage. So probably we're looking at 4 to 6 locations next year as our ideal, and we'll try to spread those around the state as uniformly as possible to capture different growing conditions in different areas. So that's kind of a middle ground of something we can still manage and get good data from, and have more representation. Because if you have too many sites, you have a lot of locations, but it becomes much harder to get good data from any of them.